What's going on, Raptors fans? Trade season is coming to a close. The deadline is in 6 days on February 9th. And most Raptors fans are pretty convinced that the Raptors are going to be making a trade at some point before the deadline. As for what they're going to do, nobody really knows. We don't know if they're going to be buyers. We don't know if they're going to be sellers. We don't really know anything about what the Raptors are going to do at the deadline. So something I like doing as a salary cap fanatic, I like looking at the salary situation, seeing if there's anything you could take from the contracts on the books to see what relevant factors might be that the Raptors are thinking through when they make their decision for the trades before the deadline. You can maybe sometimes get a gauge for what are the pressing issues that they might be factoring in their decisions, and it can help sometimes gain perspective on what might happen. So what I've done is I've got the salaries for the next 3 years, not including this one. So this is a long-term salary cap assessment for the Raptors. And we're going to try to work through some of the issues that they might be considering. So these are the salaries as of right now. You got the player options for Van Vliet and Gary Trent. You got this offseason. You got the player option for OG the next offseason. And what I'm going to really focus on are 5 players: Siakam, Van Vliet, Gary Trent, OG, and Scotty Barnes, like the core of what the Raptors have going on right now. If you notice, these are all guys that have to get paid in the next 3 off seasons. You got to pay Fred and Gary Trent this off season. You probably have to pay Siakam and OG the off season after that, and then it's time to pay Scotty Barnes after that. This isn't even accounting for Precious Achua, who also needs to be paid at the same time as Siakam and OG. So the next thing I'm going to put up here is a series of estimates of what the contracts might look like if those core 5 players get paid. So I got Siakam here with the beginning of a max deal for what his value would be at the time. These are rough figures. I don't want to bore you guys with the exact numbers, but if Siakam were to get a max deal, you're looking at roughly 50 mil in the first year, roughly 54 in the second year. Fred VanVleet and Gary Trent, both those players have had estimates in the media of the kind of money they're looking for. I saw that Fred is looking for the 30 mil a year that Hero and Hero and Jordan Poole got, and I heard that Gary Trent is looking for 25 mil a year. So, just for argument's sake, I put their contracts at slightly less than what they're looking for. If you look at Fred's deal, starts at 27, it goes up by 1 mil every offseason. If that continues on a 4 or 5 year deal, his deal averages out at slightly less than 30 mil a year. Gary Trent Jr. also 23, 24, 25 in the first 3 years. If this is a 4 or a 5 year deal, it either averages right out at the 25 or slightly less. And then you have OG. OG was a tricky one because we don't know exactly what he's looking for from a financial perspective. What we do know is that he's a very sought after player. I think it was Shams that put the report out that if OG is traded, he could see a trade package similar to Donovan Mitchell's go the other way to Toronto. So you can say his value is pretty high, and if a player is that sought after, you could even suggest that they might be a max contract caliber player. But that's hard to imagine with OG, given his injuries, given his lack of playing time as a 1 or a 2 in the offense, and also the fact that you would think contenders value OG in that way more so than rebuilding teams. And the contenders probably won't have the free agency, the cap space to sign him as a free agent. So it was definitely hard to figure out what an appropriate estimate is for OG. But I just decided to put a 32 mil a year flat contract for him. Again, it could be higher, probably won't be lower. But I thought this was a fair estimate to put. If you have a different estimate that you think is appropriate, definitely put that in the comments. And then Scotty Barnes, the last one. I have him as the first year of a rookie max extension. Of course, he could earn less than that, but if Scotty develops the way a lot of us think he's going to, then he'll definitely get a max extension. So if you put all these contracts in, This is not inclusive of Precious Achua getting paid. This is not inclusive of any draft picks on the or any first round picks on the cap sheet who at this point tend to get at least 3 to 4 mil a year yearly at minimum. It's not including any mid-level exceptions. This is a very bare bones situation for the next 2 off seasons or the next 3 off seasons. So if you look at 2024, 2025, these contracts put the team roughly 17 mil away from the luxury tax with 7 contracts on the books. So if you're to fill a team out with anything reasonable, you're pretty clear into the luxury tax. Like, it's not even close. If you were to deduct the luxury tax in this situation, you're basically filling your team up with minimum salaries aside from these 7 players on the books right now. And if you look to 2025, 26, it's even worse. You're 12 mil away from the luxury tax with 5 players under contract. So the key takeaway here is that if the core of the Raptors roster right now gets paid, this team is far into the luxury tax and has to be a contender for the money they're getting paid. And given what we've seen from this roster this year, that's not something we can reasonably expect. So what to do here? You know that if you're a buyer, if you're trying to get better, if you're trying to bring in a Kevin Durant, let's say, you probably don't have to worry about this stuff because you're going to flirt with the luxury tax as a contender anyways. I think I heard something about the Raptors ownership being willing to be in the luxury tax to bring Kawhi Leonard and Danny Green back after we won the championship. So the ownership, I guess, is open-minded to being in the luxury tax if you're a contender. But as we saw last year with the Thaddeus Young trade, the ownership wants to get far away from the luxury tax if we're not. So based on what we've seen from this roster this year and the financials as I've shown it, there's no way that we're going to pay these 5 players. And you have to look at it this way. If you just let one of these guys go in free agency, you're so far away from the salary cap that you can't just replace them with a free agent. If one of these guys just leaves in free agency, they just leave. And we have no option to replace them that we didn't have if they stayed. So if they stayed, we'd have a mid-level exception to spend, and that's all. If they left, we'd still only have a mid-level exception. The only difference being that the difference between a taxpayer mid-level exception and a not taxpayer's mid-level exception, which the difference isn't much. So just letting guys go makes the roster worse because obviously you've lost something without replacing it, and that doesn't make our team better at all. Just letting guys go in free agency, it would make an already struggling core worse. So if the Raptors aren't buyers at the deadline and the Raptors are looking to build going forward, you don't benefit from letting these guys leave. You don't benefit from paying them. This leaves you with one option. You have to trade them. And in the NBA, the trade mechanics are such that you have to take back a similar salary that you trade out. So you're not going to get a ton of cap space through trades simply by trading away a player of a high salary and getting a good player back of a lower salary. You can't trade OG making 32 mil a year for a phenomenal prospect who's making 6. That's not how it works. You have to take back roughly the same salary. So I guess the point of emphasis here is that the Raptors have to make particular trades in the event that they want to shed some salary in the trades. And I think a pretty good trade to look at to kind of get a feel for how these kind of things could go is actually the Norman Powell trade for Gary Trent Jr. So if you look at their salaries the year they got traded in 2020-21, Norman Powell was making $10.8 million, and he got traded for Rodney Hood, who was getting paid $10, and Gary Trent, who was getting paid $1.6. So just when you look at it offhand, we're basically trading Norman Powell for Gary Trent Jr. Rodney Hood was just thrown into the trade to make the salaries work. And we basically traded a guy who's making 10.8 for a guy that's making 1.6. But being that they were both free agents immediately after that season, You look at the salaries next year, Norman Powell was getting paid 15.5 and Gary Trent getting paid 16.2. So in this kind of a trade, we traded a player that was getting paid for a player on a rookie deal, but because we had to pay them immediately afterwards, we didn't in the long term actually create any cap space. And that's a relevant thing to consider when you look at the cap situation that we have going forward. So let's say you trade Fred VanVleet, a guy that we expect in the future to be getting paid roughly $28 million a year, right? If you trade him for, let's say, a guy on a rookie deal right now, right? And an expiring contract, just like the the Powell and Gary Trent Jr. deal. If you do that kind of similar thing and you let the expiring contract go, as we did with Rodney Hood, but then you pay that young player, you're in the same place financially. So we would put ourselves in the same situation of being in the luxury tax as a rebuilding team. So that's not really something I think we could do and alleviate the problem. If we were going to be sellers and we're going to trade some of these players, we have to be taking back assets that aren't going to cost us in the immediate future. So in the first 2-3 years, 3 is a bit of a stretch. In the first 2 years, I don't think we should be having to pay for the assets that we get back. If we do, I have a really hard time justifying selling in this way. If we trade VanVleet for a younger player that maybe one day is going to be as good as VanVleet, which is about as much as you could ask for if you're trading a player for a prospect, right? You're trading Norman Powell for Gary Trent, who hopefully one day would be Norman Powell or slightly better, but maybe slightly worse. That's a fair deal, right? So if you're trading VanVleet in that type of a situation, but then you're paying that young player pretty soon that same amount of money, for one, you're probably not going to be that good because you probably got worse in the short term, right? In the long term, that younger player is probably going to be better than VanVleet in 4 to 5 years. But in the short term, in the 1 to 2 years after the deal, that younger player is probably not going to be better than Fred VanVleet unless Masai pulls off a complete steal, which is not something you can just assume is going to happen. You hope it does, but you can't assume that's going to be the case. So pretty quickly, I think what we've established is if the Raptors are selling, they should be looking for players on rookie deals who are in the first 2 years of their rookie deal. So those are first round picks in the last 2 draft classes. Draft picks because they have no salary cap charge, and you're going to draft players on rookie deals and expiring deals. That's all I think is acceptable to take back in these trades. It's going to give us the space to get away from the luxury tax, give us some flexibility in the beginning of our rebuild or retool or however you want to articulate it. And the value, again, is like the whole point is that's how you're getting the value, through rookie deals or draft picks. So what I've done to potentially look at who those players might be, I looked at all the teams that the Raptors are rumored to be tied to in trade discussions, whether these teams are interested in Gary Trent, OG, Fred, any of the players on the roster that we've seen linked to other teams in the trade market. I've looked through the rosters and I've compiled the list of names of players who are in the first 2 years of their rookie deals. They were drafted in the last 2 first rounds. And put them together on a sheet here. So obviously this isn't an exhaustive list. I'm sure there's other teams that I haven't put on this list. Teams that haven't made it to, like, their interest in players hasn't made it to the media yet. So we haven't heard their names. But if you look at Portland, they have Shaedon Sharpe and Keon Johnson. I would love if Shaedon Sharpe was a Raptor. The rumors are that the Blazers were interested in trading number 7 overall for OG this past draft. Now that they have Shaedon Sharpe, does that change? Who knows? We'll see. They have Keon Johnson, a player I'm not too familiar with. I believe he was a late first-round pick. The Suns have nobody that qualifies. The Magic have Paolo, Franz Wagner, and Jalen Suggs. I just put a line through Paolo and Franz Wagner because they're not trading them for VanVleet, who is the player they're rumored to be interested in. The one player they have that fits the mold is Jalen Suggs. The Knicks only have one guy. They have Quentin Grimes, who is not him, as Scotty made clear to us. The Pelicans have Dyson Daniels and Trey Murphy. The Grizzlies have 4 players. Ultimately, players that don't get a ton of run in that rotation. And the 2 LA teams who also have no rookies that fit the mold. So you look at these teams, I think these are the players that make sense for us to take back in a way that helps figure out our financial issue if we are selling. And then the other thing you have to consider is that what are the quality of draft picks possessed by these teams? So if I'm looking at the LA teams, neither of them have immediate draft picks to trade. Neither of them have have draft picks in the future that I think Masai would want to take, because how much value is there in a draft pick from 2027? The Grizzlies have a ton of draft capital. I'm not too hot on any of these players on the list, but whatever. I may just not be informed on how good they are. The 2 Pelicans players, I actually like both of these players, but definitely there needs to be draft capital added to these 2 players. And I know they have a catalog of draft picks because they've stockpiled a lot of picks over the last few years in trades. So I could see a deal coming from New Orleans that has a combination of those 2 players, or one of them plus an appropriate amount of draft picks. That could be something I would be open in taking. Quentin Grimes, there definitely would have to be a good amount of draft picks attached to him. And I think the Knicks do have some picks in the future, so that makes them feasible. Orlando Magic, honestly, I don't know how much I love Jalen Suggs. Like, I know he gets criticized a lot by Raptors fans. Obviously, he's a young player that has some value. But if we're doing this whole Vision 6-9 thing, what are we going to do with Jalen Suggs? So, I don't know. Orlando's deal might not be so hot. Obviously, the Suns, they have, I think, their own draft pick and one extra one, but no player that fits the mold. So they would have to obviously give us a lot of draft picks. And to be honest, I wouldn't want any draft picks in the immediate next few years from that team, because they would probably be pretty good if we gave them OG or Gary Trent or VanVleet. Whoever we give them, it would make them pretty good. So I would not want their draft picks in the next 2 to 3 years. If we could get draft picks in the future, you might consider that 4 or 5 years, like not 2020, not Lakers distant, but I guess not the next 2 years either. So that pins, I guess that establishes 2 years in the middle, and you can't trade back-to-back picks. So that probably makes the Suns trade deal not that appealing either. And then the last one, you got Portland. I'm actually not sure what Portland's draft capital situation looks like, but I think their draft picks would be valuable because I think Portland could flame out. As is, I don't think their ceiling is the highest, and they're always one Dame injury from, I think, not even being a playoff team. So Shaedon Sharpe plus picks could be valuable. But yeah, these are some of the options if the Raptors choose to sell. We don't know what they're going to do, but I tried my best to do some inferences and see if I could find some hints as to what they might be considering. If they trade for any of these players, I'm going to feel like a genius. But yeah, I wanted to do a little bit of guessing. I wanted to give you guys something to think about. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. 6 days to the trade deadline, so I'm definitely going to be making videos when the trades do happen. Make sure you guys tap in for that. I'll catch you guys around. If you like this video, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, leave your thoughts in the comments, and find me on all socials at Toronto Hoop Talk.